Welcome to Huntsman Knows How. I'm your host, Kevin Gundersen, Vice President of Communications and Government Affairs, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Scott Wright, President of the Huntsman Advanced Materials Division, which for the non-Huntsman listeners means he knows a lot about aerospace, automobiles, and artificial intelligence. Today we're going to be talking to Scott about his exciting journey growing up in a small town in Scotland, to his cameo as a professional footballer, and his life today as an adopted Texan. We're also going to learn about some poignant moments in his life that have shaped one of Huntsman's top leaders. Scott, welcome to the Huntsman Knows How podcast.
Hi, Kevin. Good to be here.
It's great to have you. Scott, I want to get into all the exciting things going on in advanced materials. But before we do that, I've long been a fan of one of the most influential economists in modern history named Adam Smith. What do you have in common with Adam Smith?
Well, Kevin, it's clearly not intellect and it's clearly not a deep understanding of economics, but we did happen to be born in the same small Scottish town just a few hundred years apart.
What town?
It's the town called Kirkcaldy, which is spelt in a very strange way. It's a little town on the east coast of Scotland. There's about 50,000 people live there.
What was it like growing up there?
It was wonderful. I thought that was the beginning and the end of the whole universe, and some people still think that today.
When did you leave?
I left Kirkcaldy when I was 18 years old, and I went to the big smoke of Edinburgh, the big city.
What brought you there?
I went there to go study chemical physics at university.
So what was it back home that led you to study physics at university? Because that had to have happened somewhere back in your childhood. That's interesting interest as an 18-year-old.
It's a couple of things, Kevin. The first one is my grandfather was a welder down the mines. The east coast of Scotland was a big coal mining industry, and my grandfather was a welder, and welding down the mines wasn't a particularly luxurious job, and he spent a lot of his time, probably in his 30s and 40s, studying to become a welding lecturer at the local tech. When he was successful in doing that, he really kind of impressed upon me as a young boy that education was really important. So the kind of first thing was I wanted to go to university, and I was lucky enough to be living in Scotland at a time when somebody from my background could go to university for free. The government paid for us to go to university. But I didn't get a lot of tremendously good advice about what to study at Edinburgh University or university in general. It was really just I was good at chemistry at school, I was good at physics at school. And so I found this course called chemical physics, and I thought that sounds like it must be something to do with both of them, and that's why I ended up at Edinburgh University.
So your grandfather was a welder?
My grandfather was a welder.
And your dad?
My dad was a painter and decorator.
So you had what sounds like a blue-collar working class upbringing.
Yep, blue-collar, we call it working class over in the UK. My other grandfather was a gardener. My mother was an admin assistant, and my grandmother was a homemaker. Yeah, pretty working class background.
Talk more about that. Talk about the working class in your family, in your hometown, just Scotland.
My hometown, Kirkcaldy, also had a nickname. It was called the Lang Toon, which in English means the long town. And so the town grew up in the kind of 700s or so, right along the beach in Kirkcaldy. And the way it works is along the beach was pretty flat. Then there was kind of big hill, and the town grew up along the beachfront. And for hundreds of years, it was really a settlement, not really a big town. And as the town grew, it grew back inland, up the hill, and actually became a pretty big industrial manufacturing area. Coal mining was a big industry. The other major industry that Kirkcaldy was famous for was linoleum. And for anyone who's ever used linoleum or seen linoleum being made, it's a pretty smelly product. And so the whole town smelled of linseed oil, which is one of the basic ingredients of linoleum. And so Kirkcaldy was famous for being a bit smelly.
So everybody's linoleum floors kind of started there?
That's where I think there and in the Netherlands were the two areas where linoleum grew up as industries.
So did you start kicking a football on those beaches?
No. Playing football on the beach is difficult. No, my father...
That's only in like California in movies.
Yeah, it doesn't really work. I grew up playing football because my dad was a really good footballer, and we just played on the local park. There's a kind of famous TV show in the UK where they used to talk about throwing jerseys or jumpers down for goalposts. We take off outer layers of clothing, put them 8 feet apart, and that was the goals. We just used to play on any surface, grass, asphalt, concrete, sand if we had to.
So you're being humble right now, so I have to kind of pull it out of you, but you're probably the only Huntsman employee currently, I don't know about the past, that was a professional footballer.
I was a professional footballer for about 5 minutes.
That's more than most people could say.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. Tell us about your football career.
Like football from about the age of 7 or 8 all the way through until about 19 or 20, that was my life. That's what I wanted to do. That was the first dream I had when I was a little boy. I didn't want to be an astronaut. I didn't want to be a train driver. Didn't want to be a
chemical executive?
I certainly didn't grow up wanting to be a chemical executive, but I did want to grow up and become a Premier League footballer. That was my ambition.
That was your life. And when you say that, what did that mean from just like a day to day?
Well, the first thing was my mum and dad were absolutely strict on the fact that school came first. And so they were brilliant about making sure that I, as we would say in Scotland, stuck in at school or studied hard. I was always pretty good at that. But after school, everything was football, whether it was organised playing for my local team or whether it was just being outside with friends. I was outside all the time playing football. Summer holidays from 9 a.m. till 9 p.m, just playing football outside the whole time.
So were you in like a regiment, or was it just kind of organic, free play? I mean, obviously at some point you were in a team, in a club.
When I was younger, it was organic, right? It was just kids getting together and socialising and playing football. And, you know, I guess there's a little bit less of that nowadays than there was back then. We didn't have PlayStation.
It wasn't a business back then.
Yeah. But as I got older into my early teens, I was probably playing for 5 or 6 teams a week, whether it was my school team, I guess in the US we'd call it club team, whether it was the town representative team, the regional representative team. I actually played Scottish schoolboys representative. I was playing up to 6 times a week.
I want to come back to how your soccer career impacted your business career and what you learned playing. But at some point, 18, 19, you go to university.
Yep.
And talk about that, but also in parallel with your soccer career. Did you play at university? I mean, what's that timeline look like?
When I went to university at 18, I was signed with a local club called Wright Rovers, the finest football club in Scotland. So if you ever hear Phil Lister, who's our CFO, talking, he's a big Liverpool fan. I'm a Wright Rovers fan. Nobody's ever heard of us. We haven't done anything spectacular, but that was my hometown team, and I was signed to that club. And I was basically in a pretty tricky situation. I wasn't a good enough footballer for that to be an obvious way for me to make a career. And I wasn't smart enough to go to college and travel back 3 or 4 times a week to play for the local football team. So I had to make a choice, and I chose to go to university and accept the fact at about 18 or 19 I was never going to be a professional footballer.
What was that like? Realization, or was it like was it devastating?
For a couple of days it was devastating, but I guess real life just took over. And when you look back on it, hand on heart, I knew I was never good enough to go to the top level. And in those days, a lot less money in football. You had to get to the top 0.1% to make any sort of living out of the game. And ultimately, I ended up being a little bit smarter than I was good at football. Okay, so
where did you go to university?
Edinburgh University.
What was it like going from what was a blue-collar town, working-class town, to the biggest city in Scotland?
Second biggest. I mean, initially it was terrifying, and when I look back on it, it's almost comical. The distance between my hometown and Edinburgh was 25 miles, which was far enough to live away from home, but close enough to get back in an emergency. But it may as well have been the other end of the world to me at that point in time.
So when you were growing up, it wasn't a thing to go down there. It wasn't near your center of gravity, even though it was 25 miles.
I mean, we didn't go on holiday to Edinburgh, but that wouldn't have been unusual for blue-collar workers or blue-collar families in Scotland at that time to travel 25, 50 miles to go somewhere on vacation. You know, this was in the days before EasyJet flights and Southwest flights and so on to far-flung locations.
So you get to university, and you spent more time at university than most people because you earned your PhD. Talk about that. How did you decide that you wanted to become Dr. Scott Wright?
That was just necessity, quite honestly. My plan was to go do a 4-year college course, get a good grade, go work for the biggest chemical company in the UK at that time, which was ICI. That was anyone who did science at university would want to go and work for ICI, maybe Shell or BP, but ICI was the target company. And when I graduated my undergrad degree, was 1993, and it was a pretty depressed time in the UK at that time economically, whereas 3 or 4 years earlier, with my grades, I'd had companies like ICI almost not quite writing to me, offering me jobs, but if I applied, I'd have a really good chance of an interview. In 1993, couldn't get interviews, couldn't get jobs, and so I got offered an opportunity to do a PhD funded by a private scholarship. And so I took it, and actually the best thing I ever did in my life.
And what did you study in your PhD?
I can almost not say this with a straight face, but the title of the PhD was something like two-step laser desorption, laser photoionization, mass spectrometry.
So all the stuff you do today.
So absolutely nothing to do with what I do today.
Why? I mean, again, I'm not a technical person, but when I hear that, I'm thinking, you have to have a special place in your brain to want to spend years and years getting into that. Did you make that decision knowing you wanted to do a certain job, or was it just interesting?
No, look, I did, and as part of my degree, I did what was called the fourth year honours project. So I had to do like a 6-month project in a research lab in the university. I got allocated to this lab. It was pretty interesting stuff. I mean, you've got to be a bit of a geek to find it interesting, but that was who I was. I did this project, I enjoyed it. The professor kind of liked me, heard about this scholarship, said, why don't you apply for this? And to put it into context, I think my grand total scholarship was something like £5,000, which doesn't sound like a lot in today's money, but it was about 5 times what I was getting as a grant or a scholarship on my undergrad degree. So it felt like a fortune. And so I kind of thought, well, I can afford to live. This is interesting stuff. It's going to get me a PhD. Hopefully by then the economy's turned around and I'll have a better chance of A, getting a job, and B, maybe getting a better job than I otherwise would have done because I had more education.
So you get your PhD. Mm-hmm. Then what?
Again, complete serendipity, but I was contacted by a lady who had done her PhD in our lab, had gone to work for ICI, and they'd had no applicants from Edinburgh University that year. And given that she was the liaison between ICI and Edinburgh University, she was a little embarrassed. She knew me and asked me if I'd come for an interview. And the rest is history.
So where was your first job at ICI?
First job in ICI was in the northeast of England in a fantastic little town called Billingham, just up the road from Middlesbrough. And that was a really sizable ICI complex, big manufacturing area in the northeast of England for ICI.
Which ICI business were you in?
I was in the TiO2 business.
And for non-chemical listeners, TiO2 is
Sorry,
what?
TiO2, some of you will recall, we used to own a TiO2 business that we IPO'd out as Venator. But TiO2 is almost everything that you're surrounded by on a daily basis. It's a white pigment. It makes things bright and colourful. So whether it's the paint on your walls, the pigment in your PVC window frames, whether it's in your shopping bags, actually some of it's in toothpaste, would you believe? Even skimmed milk has TiO2 in it.
Sunblock, right?
Sunblock as well, yeah.
So you start your career, and are you in a lab? Are you in sales? Are you in R&D?
No, I was in a fundamental R&D group, fundamental research, and I was managing a couple of lab technicians looking at how we made the TiO2 crystals. The TiO2 is basically an inorganic material. It's a crystal that you have to control particle size very carefully. And I was figuring out ways to grow these crystals more efficiently, to make lighter, brighter TiO2, basically.
So how long were you there?
I was 15 years on that site, of which I did about 2 in fundamental research, and then I did a couple of years in product development, and then started moving into marketing and sales and business planning and various things like that.
And at some point, you go to Switzerland.
That's right, yeah.
When and why and how?
It's a little bit of an interesting story, at least it's interesting to me. In those days, I don't think Huntsman did quite as much movement of people between divisions. I'd got marketing director in the business and kind of thought there wasn't a lot of opportunity to move to another site within the TiO2 business. And my wife and I had decided at that stage with 2 young kids that she also worked for a chemical company, and that the kids were starting to lose out a little bit on after school activities. And so we decided that Lynn would give up work, spend more time with the kids, would focus on my career, but we would pretty much be staying in the northeast of England for the rest of our lives. We took a vacation after our last day at work, and the day after we came back from our vacation, I got asked if I'd be interested in interviewing for a role in Basel as the European VP for Advanced Materials.
And at that point, Huntsman had obviously purchased the ICI TiO2 business.
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah. Huntsman bought the ICI TiO2 business in 1999, so 2 or 3 years after I'd started work.
So you spent a lot of your life, if not at that point all of it, in Scotland, England, and now you're moving to Switzerland.
Yep.
That's a big adjustment? New adventure? Or just, let's go. Let's do it.
Well, it was something that we'd always been interested in doing, an overseas assignment. I think partly because I'd grown up in a pretty small town in Scotland, and we lived in the northeast in an even smaller village in the northeast, and we had 2 young kids. I think at that stage they were probably about 10 and 7, and we wanted them just to experience a little bit more of the world. I'd been lucky enough with the TiO2 business to travel to places in the US, to Italy, to France, to Spain, and just learn so much more about the world, different types of food, different cultures and so on. I'd never really left Scotland until I was about 22, 23 years old. And I didn't want my kids to not leave the UK until they were 22, 23 years old. I wanted them to get a little bit more exposure to new ideas and new ways of thinking. And so we'd always been looking for an overseas assignment. And then this one came up, happened to be at a really easy time to make the decision because didn't have to worry about my wife's job or any impacts there. We were just ready to lift up and go. And so was lucky enough to be offered that position. I think we got offered that position in June 2011, and by July 2011, the 4 of us were living in Basel.
That job obviously went very well because 5 years later, you were then the president of the Huntsman Advanced Materials Division, living in the Woodlands, Texas. So that's a big move. Scotland, England, Switzerland, Texas.
Yeah, and in some ways, I think as I look back on it, I think our family was quite naive, thinking that moving from the UK to a German-speaking country, or part of the country, Switzerland, would have been really difficult. Actually, looking back on it, that was actually quite an easy transition. The kids were very quick to adapt to the new education system. Actually, kids learned the language really well. So did my wife, not so much me. They did really well. They settled very quickly there. And because the kids had settled so quickly, we thought, well, moving to the US, where we watch the same TV shows, we speak the same language. Not so sure that's true. We almost speak the same language. Sometimes we spell things a little bit differently. We thought that would be an easier transition. It actually turned out to be a much more difficult transition, which I think was predominantly down to the fact that the kids were now 15 and 12, approaching teenage years, had formed a lot of good friendships, and that was a little bit more difficult. But yeah, it was a big move.
So you were vice president for 5 years.
Yep.
You obviously did something in your job as vice president, European Advanced Materials, that caught the eye of people at headquarters. Becoming a president of division is a very significant job. What happened in Europe that, you obviously caught the attention of people running the company?
Well, I think if you look back at the 2011 timeframe, when actually the major change in the division at that point wasn't me going to Europe. It was actually James Huntsman taking over as division president, having been the VP of Americas. So James came in, he built a team around him that he thought could improve the business. And our business was really struggling back in 2011. And I think Advanced Materials today is a much stronger business than it was back in 2011. But back then we had a lot of exposure to the commodity side of the business. We had very high costs and high cost manufacturing locations, and we had to make some really difficult calls and decisions and do some really difficult work. But we had a great team of people who understood the business, understood what needed to be done, and kind of oriented around what needed to happen over what time frame and got it done really quickly. And we took a business that was marginally profitable and turned it into something that was very profitable, over a 3, 4, 5 year time period. And that wasn't just a European thing. That happened in Asia. That happened in the Americas as well.
So you get to Texas in 2016. How long until you owned a pickup truck?
Oh, goodness. 4 years until I owned a pickup truck. But I did own a Jeep before I owned a pickup truck.
Okay.
Well, so I experimented.
I know you well enough to know that you have developed a love of Texas and a love of the U.S. Tell us about that.
It's nothing more than if you're going to live somewhere, you need to embrace where you're living and fit in with the culture. Otherwise, you're going to be pretty lonely. Your family's not going to have a great time. So whether it was being in Switzerland, I was 41 years old when I went to Switzerland. I'd never stood on a pair of skis. The first time I stood on a pair of skis, I fell over pretty quickly, and it took me several weeks to figure out how not to fall over. But having persevered, and also the fact that my kids on day one could ski down a black slope and I couldn't, the competitive part of me. Anyway, long story short, we really embraced skiing in Switzerland and had some of the most phenomenal times as a family, having learned to do something that we'd never have got an opportunity to do in the UK. And so having had that experience coming over to Texas, then you've got to embrace what Texas has got to offer. Yes, I'm a proud owner of an F-150 pickup truck.
What are some of those comparisons or contrasts between living in England, Switzerland, and the U.S.? I mean, obviously England and Switzerland are very, very different places, but I think, in my typical American mindset, that's Europe.
Yeah.
Talk about the differences between the two places, or the three places.
You do know, Kevin, that's like me saying
America's
America's all
it's like
the same,
saying,
right?
It's like saying Boston's the same as New York. I get it.
Yeah.
I know.
Okay. It's a good question. Like, we're relatively outdoorsy as a family. I think Europe, or at least I'm going to call it UK because that's kind of where we came from, has a different type of outdoorsy opportunity than somewhere like Texas does. And so in the UK, you can be as outdoorsy as you want. You just have to dress for the occasion, right? Which is usually wrap up warm in the middle of summer and go hiking or mountain biking or whatever. You come to Texas, I don't really find the idea of hiking up a hill, if you can find one in Texas in the middle of summer, that appealing an idea. But you've got beautiful lakes where you can get into water sports and so on. I never thought I would say something like this, but it's not so far to Colorado where you can go and do the sort of outdoorsy stuff that you can do in the UK, but you get guaranteed weather. And so look at everyone that has an opportunity to experience a different environment and different culture. If you've got the mindset to go and try things, you'll find things that work for you and your family. That's kind of what worked for us.
So when you went from being the VP of Europe to the president of division, you found yourself in your new job here with how many people in your division?
We had about 2,000 people in the division.
That's a lot of people and a massive responsibility. What was that like at the beginning? Year one, year two? That's a big adjustment.
Well, in Europe, I had about 1,000 people, and so I don't think that there's such a massive difference when you go. I think going from a team where you've got responsibility for 2 or 3 people up to 20, 30, that's a big step. Going from 20, 30 up to 1,000 is a big step. And the things that you have to do to be successful, I think, are less dependent when you go from 1,000 to 2,000. I think I had a pretty good training ground. I had great bosses that kind of helped me understand how to manage that level of complexity. And even more importantly, I had great people in my team that knew what they were doing. They were experts in their field, and I just had to help guide them to make the right decisions.
So you've been in their job for 8 years. You've made changes. The business is very healthy, very steady, great profit source for Huntsman. Serves some wonderful sectors, aerospace, automotive, infrastructure. What have you learned about people and getting them behind a goal and a strategy and execution? Because you've done some things in the division that I think I met you in your first week here in the Woodlands because I started here at Huntsman the same time. So I've watched that progression. What have you learned as a leader, as a person?
Oh, good question. I think people just want, first of all, people want security for their families, right? And people want to be successful. Nobody, in my belief, nobody comes to work to try and do a bad job. The huge majority of people want to come to a business that's got a bright future, where they understand how they fit in, a business that they've got a clear vision of what that success is going to look like. And it sounds like it must be quite easy to write down a vision on a piece of paper about what you want the business to look like, and for everyone to automatically orientate around that vision is remarkably difficult. And it doesn't happen by a phenomenal PowerPoint presentation. It doesn't happen by a phenomenal positioning paper or whatever. It happens through hundreds and thousands of conversations all the way through the organization, trying to make sure that every single person in the business understands how they fit into what we're trying to achieve as a business.
I have to say, Scott, I was in China in January, and we visited an advanced materials plant, and I saw the visual communications at the plant. And it's the same thing that's here at the headquarters. And I think I said to you when we were there, again, it's anecdotal, but that's how you drive change. That's how you get people rowing in the same direction, because that's 7,500 miles away from the headquarters. And it's the same message.
Yeah, and look, I think that happens through building good teams. So look, what's going to work with Grace and her team in Panyu is not going to be cut, copy, paste for what's going to work with Mike Quinn and his team in McIntosh, Alabama. But what Grace and Mike have got to be able to do is understand where the division is trying to go to, and how do you translate that expectation back to local cultures, local environments, and actually individuals through the organisation.
So, Scott, I want to shift gears a little bit away from the business and talk about you and some general topics. I'm going to ask you a personal question. Mm-hmm. We didn't talk about it earlier, but I know your dad passed away when you were relatively young. And that is a moment in a person's life that you could go one way or the other. You could respond negatively to something like that, positively to something like that. What did his passing mean for you as a person?
No question, that was the worst day of my life up until that point in time. My dad was 46 years old, playing football, the sport that I love, and he had a heart attack and, to the best of my knowledge, died instantly. It was actually the day before I started my PhD, and it was just an enormous shock to me, to my mother. My mother was a young woman, 45 years old, and my younger brother, 19. And all of a sudden, the kind of centre of our family wasn't there anymore. It was a challenge. Still find it really difficult to talk about today.
How did it impact you as a dad? You have two sons.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, look, I think I learned a lot of really fundamental life lessons from my dad. My mum as well. My mum's a really strong woman. She's about 5'1" and a force of nature. And I guess having had to deal with two young men, I guess, by that stage on her own for a few years, that didn't do anything to dilute that. Yeah, I learned a lot from my dad, and I often think, even still think today, what would my dad do in a particular situation? But what was actually interesting is most of my formative memories of my father and what I think he would do, he was actually way younger than I was when I was asking what my father would do. So it was quite an interesting situation.
If you could go back to college, what would you major in?
I asked myself this question a lot in my early days.
It's an interesting question because when you're successful and you get to a certain point, you kind of look back, and I've heard you say, I don't use a lot of what my PhD was in my work. No. So it makes you think, what would I have been interested in back then? Knowing what I know now, what would I do back then?
So this will surprise a lot of people, but the thing I was actually best at school was English and literature. But I couldn't figure out how I was going to get a job doing an English lit degree. So if I was doing a degree for pure enjoyment, that's what I'd have gone and done at college. And I know that there'll be some of my colleagues who think I can barely speak English. That's really unusual that you'd want to go and study at Scott. That's what I wished that I'd done when I actually went to college for pure enjoyment purposes. When I actually look back, I think if I'd known I was going to be in a business environment like this, I may have done something that had more finance component to it than I did at college.
That's same for me. Political science major. I wish I had a little bit more foundation on financials. Since you're talking about literature and books, well, it's a good segue into books. Are there any books that have shaped your life?
Probably the book that had the biggest impact on my life. There were only ever 2 copies produced, and that was my PhD thesis. Just because, and it's not because it's a good read, trust me, it's not.
I'm not going to ask for a copy.
In fact, the kind of funny to me sidebar was my mum, when there were 3 copies produced. I gave a copy of my PhD thesis to my mum. And she said, I'm going to read this. I said, Mum, you're not going to read this. I said, it's the worst, driest book you're ever going to read. She said, no, but it's your book, son. I'm going to read it. She got to page 2. But look, I learned a lot during the PhD because doing a PhD kind of taught you how to be self-starting and how to plan and organise your work, how to meet deadlines and such like. And so that actually did have a pretty big impact on my life. Other books, unlike Peter, I think Peter's a big lover of military history, etc. That's not tended to be the sort of stuff I read. I have read quite a few business books that I think have been pretty informative. The latest one that I read that was recommended to me by a team member actually was called The 5 Dysfunctions of Teams. And it's a really short book. It's probably about 150 pages, big letters, pretty easy to read. And it's all about a dysfunctional team that's underperforming, and that had a pretty fundamental impact on me.
I just want to say for the listeners that Scott recommended that book, and I did read it, and I want to second his recommendation that for anybody looking to learn about teams and developing teams and dealing with problems, it is definitely worth 2 hours.
Yeah.
Tell us about the book.
Unlike a lot of business books, it's not one that's written from a theoretical context. It's written as a story. And it's about a lady who goes in to turn around a failing organization. She comes in as the CEO. The team's got great products, great technology, talented people, and yet it's not delivering what shareholders expect. And she basically sits back and watches them for 2 weeks and then reports out to them what she's seeing in terms of team behaviours that are fundamentally causing most of the issues. And look, I think we've got great teams here in Huntsman, but one of the things I recognised from reading the book was some of the behaviours this author thought about as being dysfunctional and getting in the way of teams delivering what they're trying to do. You see it on a daily basis. I would challenge anyone to read that book and not have seen any of these behaviours before.
Yeah, having read the book, I agree with you, because I kind of came away from reading the book feeling like a lot of the little things that we all see in our relationships professionally and even personally, they add up. And what happens over time when you have little disagreements about things is they just permeate a culture and they permeate teams and they bring teams down. People get focused on stuff that just doesn't matter. How do you take what you read in a book like that and put it into action?
Well, I think you have to think about kind of what that main message in the book is. Does it apply to a particular situation? And what's the best way to go about implementing it? I mean, sometimes it's as simple as, team, I'd like you to go and read this book and come back and share your thoughts with us. Sometimes, I think in this case, it actually has a pretty good framework for working through with a team in terms of how you diagnose what your major issues are and how you go about fixing them. We kind of ran the process that the book suggested, and it really depends. I think it's really important as a manager of any sort of a team is that you keep reading sources of new inspiration for different ways to look at problems. Every team's got problems, every business has got problems, and the responsibility of managers and leaders is to find new ways to look at them to make things better. And I don't think it matters whether you get your inspiration from other leaders that have gone before, whether it be presidents of countries or presidents of businesses or whatever, or whether it's academics. If you can find a solid theory that fits your problem, you should steal it with pride and do something with it.
Your business sells products into some of the biggest, most consequential industries in the world. Aerospace, automotive, infrastructure. How do you get information and figure out what matters?
Well, there's the obvious part, right, which is you've got to just keep on top of daily events, daily news, reading newspapers from different sources. Don't always go to the same source for your information. Don't just watch TV. Don't just rely on social media. Don't just rely on the newspapers. You've got to take a good bit of your day to get information like that. But honestly, I think the best way I get access to information is I think I've got a phenomenal team who are all expert and super smart in their own area. And the thing that fundamentally makes you pay attention to what matters is when your team are passionate about a particular issue, and when you trust them, you better take into account what they're saying because they're usually right.
Diversity of information, diversity of source, bounce it off smart people, and then make your best assessment.
Yeah.
It's sad that that's harder said than done these days, given just the volume of information that we all get.
Yeah, and also back to the dysfunctions of teams. One of the biggest issues teams often have is dealing with conflicting points of view. The best teams I've seen working are the ones who embrace conflict and debate ideas and issues, even when they fundamentally or at least initially disagree with it. I think what you find is usually once you've debated the issue, you may be apart by 1 or 2%, not 50 or 60%. That's a really healthy dynamic to have within a team.
So it sounds from listening to you, talking about the book and information, you've obviously evolved and grown as a leader. 10 years ago, what are things you did or things you thought that as you, look back now, you're like, I was totally wrong?
I think 10 years ago, I just probably thought I was right about everything, and I've learned over the years through
a Scotsman? No, never.
I've learned over the years that many times when I thought I was right, I was wrong, and other people were right. And so even though some of the team might not think that I listen much better than I did 10 years ago, I think I listen better. I think I'm a bit more conscious now of the environment you create for people to contribute. Someone like me who's got, let's call it a strong desire to be right all the time, if I'm going to debate every single issue to the nth degree with someone, if that happens in every meeting for like 3 or 4 years, I probably shouldn't be surprised that some people stop bringing me contentious ideas. And so I think recognising that kind of weakness in my character trait and trying to modify it is probably what's changed over the last 10 years or so.
So it takes self-reflection. You have to constantly look at yourself and have a willingness to examine, assess, and ultimately change.
Yeah, be willing to listen to feedback from people. Yeah.
So what is your average weekend?
Well, it's changed a lot these last couple of years.
Yeah, you lost some birds in the nest.
We did. I used to be almost exclusively focused on what I used to call dad's taxi, taking kids to soccer games. And now
I have five games this weekend. Yeah. Can't wait.
Nowadays, it's much more relaxed. My wife and I both like good food and fine wine, so there's a little bit of the weekend sometimes devoted to eating out in some nice places. Again, back to the comment earlier on skiing. Anywhere you go, or not so much anywhere you go, but every few years I think you've got to try something brand new. And so I've just recently learned to wake surf, and that's becoming a bit of a passion. It's also something that I can do that when I fall over, it's a lot softer than falling on snow and ice.
You run a global business, and the geopolitical environment right now is very different than it was 10 years ago. And that presents risks, opportunities for somebody like you and a company like Huntsman. When you look at the world today and you see China, United States, regionalization, you see structural changes happening in the world. How do you think about that? How do you approach it? How do you manage it? Because it is something you have to manage, running a global business.
Well, fundamentally, I'm not one that subscribes easily to in a short space of time, we're going to completely disaggregate the global economy.
Right.
I just
you don't think globalization's going away?
No, I don't know that it'll keep moving on at the pace that it was moving. I think it's going to slow down. You're going to find pockets where you are going to have isolated and local supply chain channels, but I think completely unwinding what's happened over the last 30 or 40 years is going to be almost impossible to put that toothpaste back in the tube. There are certain conflicts that can happen that may make that more challenging. But like, for example, when we meet with the local governments in China, we actually find quite a lot of support and a lot of interest in collaborating with us, because at the end of the day, we create employment, we create prosperity for their local population. I think when you get to the federal government, the Chinese government, I think that interaction is a little bit different. So in our case, for example, in China, we're working hard to develop good local reputations and good local contacts. The chances of major investments, for example, right now are probably less than they were a few years ago. And so what that means is we've got to pivot to how do we grow our business in an environment where we're not going to do what we would have done 20 years ago, which is build a new asset. And that's when you need creative leaders and creative team members to help you think through that.
So staying on this topic of kind of global trends, I'm going to throw a couple terms out there, and I want you to respond how you see them, not only as a business leader, but also as a scientist, because a couple of these terms, I think, have entered the political realm and are a little bit detached from scientific reality. But that's my view. You may have a different view. So I'm going to throw them out there. I want to hear your thoughts. First one is energy transition.
I think, first of all, the transition away from fossil fuels is at least happening from an idea standpoint. I think we're not seeing material shift in energy sources on an absolute term, but we are seeing growth in areas like wind and solar, in hydrogen or sources of power. I think the energy transition is going to be much slower than many of our people around the world are being told it's going to happen, and I think that happens. I think that's the case for a few reasons. It ultimately comes down to return on investment. Somebody's going to have to pay for all of these technologies to be developed and implemented, and I think it's probably unreasonable to expect a fossil fuel economy that took 150 years to develop to be unwound in 20. I think you will, like when we get 50, 60, 70 years down the line, I think we will have a very different sources of energy than we've got today. I don't think we'll be at net zero, for example, by 2050. I think that's almost impossible to happen. I think governments are unable to enable that sort of investment to happen. Companies are not going to blindly put money into something that has a limited chance of working on that time frame. I think it's an unreasonable expectation that we're going to get to that sort of level of transition on that time frame.
Do you think a very low interest rate environment for a long period of time has kind of led to some of this exuberance around energy transitions and net zero? A lot of promises made by governments and political leaders, some business leaders.
Well, look, I think low interest rates would have certainly made some of those investments look a little bit more palatable. The business cases would have been better. I don't know that it was just free money that made everybody jump on this bandwagon. And again, I want to be clear. I'm not trying to say that moving away from fossil fuels is a bad thing. What I'm saying is, let's be honest in the conversation about how likely it is to happen. There's no point promising people that they can have a seamless transition from ICE vehicles to electric vehicles, and you're going to have complete free and easy access to charge vehicles when you need them, when that investment is never going to be there in time. And I just think, I don't think there's an honest conversation going on about that. I think what you're starting to see happening now is maybe some unwinding of the regulatory timeframes that were being talked about, requests to have them pushed back, because we already know it's not going to be deliverable. That doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't engage in the energy transition. It's just we need to be pragmatic about it.
We're going to go back to culture in a second, but the last one I kind of want to throw out for you, which I know is near and dear to your heart, that's carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS, in the policy and business world.
I think when we talk about carbon capture, people hear carbon capture, they think carbon. Actually, what people are really meaning when they talk about carbon capture is CO2 capture. CO2 capture, I'm not saying that's a bad idea. I think the cost and the logistics of stripping carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and pumping it underground is going to be challenging and costly and such like. And I think some things we need to be much more focused on are things like our middle-on technology that instead of creating CO2 in the first place, just creates carbon, true carbon capture. And then I think the trick's going to be for society or researchers to figure out how do we take that carbon material and do useful things from it. I mean, just think back 50, 60 years ago, we didn't have any plastic polymers. And today our world is using plastic as one of the kind of fundamental building materials across a whole host of applications like aerospace, automotive, building construction, and so on and so forth. Well, what if we could take carbon, structural carbon like we've got with Miralon, and develop something or develop products where we can substitute plastic products with these carbon-based products? That would be a pretty cool way to take an almost limitless feedstock of fossil-based fuels, turn it into clean-burning hydrogen and useful structural materials that we can build our world with in the future. That's something that I think is enormously exciting. And it's not something that Huntsman's going to be able to do on its own. We need scientists and applications development all over the world in multiple countries to be developing these applications on a carbon-based raw material that's going to be plentiful in the years to come.
Yeah, and in this case, you're talking about materials that could be building materials, automotive materials. I mean, we're talking about new materials that change the world.
Yeah, we're talking about replacing steel, replacing carbon fiber, replacing or making much better use of concrete by making much stronger materials using this new carbon-based technology.
You talked about culture a few minutes ago. What are your thoughts on the trends in the current workplace around work from home versus being in the office to build a career? You manage many people. You've dealt with these issues. We've dealt with them. Every company's dealing with them. How do you look at that?
It's complicated. There's no easy answer. First of all, I think that COVID obviously forced us to work in a particular way that we'd never done en masse before. But I also think that there's a bit of a myth regarding what happened pre-COVID, where there was this view that the workplace was this inflexible operation, that you had to be chained to your desk between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. and you weren't allowed away for any reason in between. And I look at a company like Huntsman that if somebody needed time off for a doctor's appointment, had a childcare emergency, or a sick parent, sick kids, Huntsman's been an incredibly flexible employer for decades. And to some degree, this working from home was fixing a problem that didn't really exist. Now, we're certainly, I don't think, ever going to go back to the fully in the office working model. But I do think during the COVID period, where most of our people were working a significant amount of time away from the office, we definitely missed some of the human interactions and almost the knowledge of what's going on in the business by osmosis. And then we started to rely much more on town halls and email communications and such like. And they're just less effective than a one-on-one conversation. Again, if you'll never change someone's hearts and minds on a video call, you can do that on a face-to-face conversation, whether it be in someone's office, by the coffee machine. I think that human interaction is where you actually capture people's hearts and minds, and you make a difference, and you can engage people in a strategic journey. And so we've got to work hard to create that sort of an environment. It's
very hard to build a career at home. You can do work at home. You can do work in front of a screen, but you can't build a career from home, in my opinion.
I don't know that it's can't. I think it's more challenging. And I think, again, it's tough to build a relationship remotely. You can build relationships with colleagues when you're with them on a consistent basis. And so, look, we have had remote workers for many, many years. Again, we've built relationships with them, not through video calls, but by getting face-to-face with them on an appropriate frequency and cadence. And I think that's what we've got to focus on, is building relationships between people, because that's how you build trust in an organisation. When you build trust in an organisation, that's how you can really get things moving.
Right now, there is engineering grad student looking on LinkedIn at jobs, and hopefully they come across a Huntsman advertisement for an entry-level position for a chemical engineer, physicist, chemist. Why should they join Huntsman?
Phenomenal opportunities, in a single phrase. I mean, we talked earlier about what I wanted to be when I was a kid, what I wanted to be when I was a recent graduate, and I ended up being none of those things. I don't think your average worker knows what they really want their career to end up like. You join a company like Huntsman, first of all, you've got to join an environment in which you're comfortable, okay, that shares the same sort of values, now the kind of values that Huntsman's got of honesty, integrity, treating people fairly, doing the right thing, even when it's not the best financial decision for the business. That's all something that's been part of Huntsman for decades. And so you need to be attracting people that fit into that kind of environment. But Huntsman's a company where you can come in as an engineer or a sales individual or a customer service person or an R&D associate, and you can end up anywhere in the company. If you've got the talent, the ambition, you'll certainly get the opportunity, because Huntsman works that way.
You talked about your grandfather being a welder.
Yeah.
And your working class upbringing in Scotland. Could you have ever imagined that you would be where you are today?
I didn't really know what this was when I was living in Kirkcaldy and dreaming of being a footballer. So no, not at all. And I think that's why Huntsman's been such a great company for me to spend 95% of my career in, is because they consistently offered me opportunities to try something a little bit different and trusted me to do something good with it. And I like to think I did okay at various points along the way, and then that led to other opportunities. And so I'm not a big believer in having a concrete 5, 10, 15, 20-year career plan. You've just got to continue to do what's important to you and for your family. And I wanted to challenge myself in various different areas. Huntsman was happy to give me lots of opportunities to do that. It's been an absolute blast all the way.
Scott, we've been sitting here for over an hour talking about your life and your career and the things that have shaped you as a person. What is a piece of wisdom that you want to leave listeners that has shaped you as a person?
Something my dad often said to me was, you've got to try and be the best that you can be. And as long as you're doing your best on a daily basis, trying to get better day after day, then things will work out just fine for you. And that was something that my dad would say, just to encourage me to not get overly stressed about the things I couldn't control, but to worry about the things that I could control. And he also said to me, this is a football analogy, but I think it applies equally well to any other aspect of life, is when things are going really well, you're only as good as your last game, and if you have a bad game tomorrow, you're going to be back to square one. So you've got to keep on top of things as well.
That's wonderful. Scott, thanks for joining me today for a fantastic discussion. Your life from Scotland to Switzerland to the U.S. is an inspiration, and your career is something that I think many of our associates can look up to and try to emulate. And thank you, listeners, for joining us for another episode of Huntsman Knows How. We'll see you next time.